Welcome. I'm Seth Wentz, and along with Chris Dawson, the Lecture Committee Chair, we're happy to have you joining us this evening. It's my honor to have Thomas Phifer, founder of Thomas Phifer & Partners, joining us for our AIA Central Pennsylvania Spring Lecture. Our chapter prides itself on bringing high-quality guests to share their experiences and works with our members. Guests have included such talent as Toshiko Mori, Marlon Blackwell, Shigeru Ban, Todd Williams and Billy Chen, Peter Bowen, and that's just to name a few. Since the pandemic, we've been very fortunate to be able to continue offering these virtual events, and we're joined in the spring by Rand Elliott, and this past fall by Annabelle Seldorf. These events would not be possible without the continued support of our sponsors. Their contributions have been especially impactful during this past year. I'd like to thank each sponsor for making this experience possible. Spring Lecture sponsors can be found in the digital program that each member received earlier today via the email link. Sponsors include Armstrong Ceiling Solutions, Campbell Associates, Chris Dawson Architect, Conestoga Tile, Crabtree Rohrbaugh and Associate Architects, Glenn Gary, Maury, Murray Associates, Murphy and Didenhafer Architects, Onyx Design and Consulting, Think Design, Tippis Weaver Architects, and Whitney Bailey Cox and Magnani. We sincerely thank you for making this event possible. I'd also like to thank Jim White of Chris Dawson Architects for putting the postcards and programs together, and Michelle McKenna, our AIA-PA staff support, for helping coordinate the event. Thomas Phifer has been gracious enough to allow us to record the presentation. The recording will be accessible through the AIA Central Pennsylvania website and can be rewatched or shared with those who are unable to attend. Today's presentation is registered for one learning unit, but Thomas has told me that there's a fair amount of slides, so if we approach an hour and a half, the credits will be adjusted accordingly. Since graduating from Clemson University in 1977, Thomas Phifer has devoted himself to high-quality, timeless built environments. He received the prestigious Rome Prize in Architecture from the American Academy of Rome in 1995 and was awarded the Medal of Honor from the New York chapter of the AIA in 2004. Since 1997, Thomas Phifer & Partners has received 4 Design Excellence Awards from the General Service Administration and more than 20 awards from the American Institute of Architects, as well as numerous national and international citations. Thomas Phifer has served as visiting professor at numerous schools of architecture, including Columbia, Cooper Union, University of Southern California, University of Texas, University of Pennsylvania, and Cornell University. Mr. Phifer has been appointed the William Henry Bishop Visiting Professor of Architecture and Design and the Louis Kahn Visiting Professor of Architecture and Design, both from Yale School of Architecture. These accomplishments, however, as impressive as they may be, are not the main reason I invited Thomas to join us this evening. About 10 years ago, I had the honor of being nominated by the National Associate Committee to serve as the Associate Young Architect Representative on the AIA National Design Awards jury. One of the best parts of being on the jury was the 3 to 4 days of in-person jury debate at the AIA headquarters in DC. After months of communicating via email, the jury members finally were able to meet in person and debate over the 130 or so projects that were whittled down from the hundreds of submissions received. I had the good fortune of being sat next to Thomas Phifer during these debates. Thomas wasn't the most outspoken person at the table, and I have to be honest that I wasn't as familiar as I probably should have been with his work at the time. I wasn't sure what to make of him at first, but over those days, I became familiar enough with my jury neighbor. What stuck with me most about him was the quiet yet strong nature of the gentleman sitting to my left. As we're all aware, architects are notorious for making opinions known. Interestingly enough, Thomas didn't try and comment on every project we reviewed, but when he did comment, either for or against the project, the room listened and often the room agreed. I witnessed the final award recipients being forged in part by the subtle and strong opinions of the man to my left. Fast forward a couple of years, after that experience, I never stopped watching his career. He continued to create projects that were much like the person I briefly met. Structures that were subtle but strong, like the Glenstone Museum and the Corning Museum of Glass. Projects that didn't need flashy colors or new materials to create experiences, but rather used light and form to immerse guests in a thoughtfully conceived environment. With that, I welcome Thomas Phifer, FAIA, to join us and share your experiences.
Can everybody hear me? Yes. Thank you, Seth. That was so nice of you. Boy, what a generous introduction. And it's really an honor to be here. I'm sorry I can't see you all, but we have a few projects that I'd like to share with you today. Okay, Ken? This is our office here in New York, just before we get started with a few projects. We work around a dining table, although we haven't been in our office since last March, but when things come back in September, we all work around the dining table here. We communicate, everyone's here. We have meetings that are out in front of everyone. There are no closed offices. The only room that's really closed together. It is like a family, it is like a dining table. And we've learned this over the years, that this has been really productive for all of our folks, okay? And so tonight I'd like to share with you the 4 museums that we've been fortunate enough to work on. These date back to about 2004, 2005, beginning with the North Carolina Museum of Art. After that, Corning, after that, Flintstone, and under construction right now is the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw. Okay? And so now the North Carolina building, just to start. You know, when we started here, I arrived and was completely attracted and taken away by this Giotto gold framed painting. It was a remarkable picture, and it sat in this room that was only lit by artificial light. But it was a remarkable picture, and every time I'd go there, I'd like a magnet, I would go to this work. And this work was the inspiration to bringing light, to bringing daylight into this new work, okay? They have the good fortune of having 160 acres of land here. It's right beside an Everett DeBrell stone building that was completed after his death. And one wanted to let nature permeate the experience here, where the landscape, where this park, where this art park would be knitted into the experience of this remarkable collection. You can see our building up there to the upper left with the parking to the right, okay? And so we started to develop this strategy of making an open building, more of a pavilion. These are works that are as old as Egyptian mummies, and they go all the way up to contemporary. And we then wanted to make these gardens, these courtyards, these vestibules to the landscape. These places that no matter where you were, no matter what collection, you'd be able to then look outside into a garden, have a relationship to the daylight of a garden, and begin to weave that into this experience of the art, okay? And we looked at the Louisiana. This is outside of Copenhagen. And in this work, they weave the landscape and the experience of the light and the experience of the land and the trees into the experience of the art. This is a remarkable place. And you see it more, not particularly for its detailing or its materiality, but for its remarkable connection with this landscape as you move through, okay? And so when we began to look at this project, we thought of it from the beginning as a 1-story building, 75,000 square feet of gallery space with a little cafe. And we thought of the entire collection being on one floor and moving through each one of these works that have relationships to other works in the collection from a different life, from a different generation. But we also wanted as much to have the gardens come in to the experience. We wanted to use daylight here. This was the first museum that we worked on, and it seemed like that to have these 75,000 square feet completely top lit, so that it would bring a kind of equality of light, this kind of celebration of light and art. You know, nature is not only trees and grass, but it's light. It's the movement of light, the changing light. And to have all of these works be under this beautiful light seemed like it was a wonderful strategy for this collection to bring it from the darker building into the light. Okay. One of the first things I saw when I went overseas, when I was in Genoa, Italy, studying with Clemson University, was this building by Sir John Soane, the Dulwich Gallery, and how he made these lanterns. And he made these kind of pitched sides. And he gave the light plenty of distance to fall. This was a remarkable room to see as a student. And we used this as a prototype, as a guide, to try to make the museum filled with this light, okay? And so we made these coffers. We made these on the computer, we built models of them, and we sculpted them for the light. We tried light from this kind of soft light that would make it over to the walls, that would make it down to the floor for sculpture. We tested and tested it. And we wanted to make this shape completely tuned to the softness of the daylight. These things, we had a very limited budget on this building. Each one of these coffers ended up costing only about $3,500. They spanned 27 feet. They were these remarkable units that just needed to get sanded and painted, okay? And so we call this drawing the alligator mouth. It shows you the roof and how the roof is continuous over all the collections. But these particular precincts for the different collections, with the gardens coming into those experiences, being able not just to have one entrance, but 4 entrances into the museum. Because it was free, it's a state museum, you could enter the museum from any one of these 5 doors and leave from any one of these 5 doors. So it was open and accessible and welcoming, and you entered through the landscape, this park, these gardens, okay? And here is one of the vestibules, these garden vestibules. This is the Rodin Garden with water. You can see the light as it begins to come up at night and begins to reveal the collections on the inside, okay? And so these coffers, these softly lit gallery spaces, they had removable and changeable and tunable scrims at the top of these. So for contemporary art, where you could have more light, we had a scrim there that was more open. And then for these giottos, see, there's that beautiful painting that I loved and adored. For that painting, we had a scrim that was more tightly woven. And these things were like these hoops that you have when you want to put in your windshield. We bought these from England. We had to make these sizes up especially for us. But it's a very simple device that comes in and out very quickly so that we could tune each one of the galleries depending on the collection. And there's one of the views out to the gardens, okay? And I'll just move through these very quickly. These are all gallery rooms, but none of them have four corners. They're all open to other rooms. So you can move from one collection to the other freely, so that you begin to feel this transition of history, okay? And then another one of the collections, this happens to be the African collection, as you're looking out into a garden, okay? Okay. And so the director here, Larry Wheeler, was a remarkable person, is a remarkable person. And Larry's idea was not to put these dark colors on the walls, greens, blues, reds that you find in most museums that hold these early American pictures, but to neutralize and to put all of the works in the museum on the same ground, on the same footing, so that you see the works all together. And so he wanted everything to be white so that the light and the pictures would come alive together. Just a little note here, all of the supply air comes out of that little 1-inch slot at the top. The return air is that little 1-inch slot at the bottom. There are little tracks in between each one of the coffers for lighting, for security, cameras, sprinklers, so that we begin to not have any distractions with the art, okay? Okay. And so each one of the pictures, these rooms were curated beautifully and made these particular moments for these important pictures in these alcoves to have a very unique experience. The ceiling height here to the bottom of the coffers is 16 feet with another 12 feet up to the underside of the coffers, okay? So the light would have plenty of room to fall. So as you enter the museum, as you've been out in the landscape, this is the front door. As you enter, you come into this kind of reflective moment here that reflects the landscape. It has this relationship where it begins to blur your relationship. It begins to bring you down to this 12-foot dimension, this 12-foot height. And so as you walk, you begin to experience the landscape in a different way, in the same way that Dan Graham works, placing you in this moment, not through indigenous materials, but through the reflection of the place. The reflection of the place grounds you in this place, grounds you in this experience with the landscape, okay? And then out on the landscape, these were taken just after the museum is open. This Roxy Payne tree, this rock garden that enters, okay? Enters the experience, okay? And then Ursula von Reitingswald installed right after the museum is opened. There you can see the vaults of the coffers coming up to receive the daylight. The Rodin court is to the left, okay? You know, the person that we were working with who was managing the project from the museum side got to the very end of the project. I bet there was only 8 months left, and we hadn't found the money to make the facade. And finally, the contractor totaled up everything we had spent. We had a very particular budget, $65 million for the entire building and landscape. And we found just enough to make this aluminum facade. This facade that's made out of these panels that are about 5.5, 6 feet wide and about 22, 23 feet tall. And we just started to overlap them. There's a little piece of polished stainless steel back in the joint. But as time goes on and the landscape begins to grow closer to the building, to these panels, they give forth this soft reflection of the sky, of the trees, of the light, of the grass, so that in a sense the building becomes this reflection of nature here. So we were lucky enough to get these panels into the project at the very end that have the same ethos as the opening argument about putting this building in this park, in this land, in this place, okay? And another view of the Rodin Court just after it opened, okay? And then this is the sustainability model. Way back when, this building opened in about 2009, 2010. It's about 11 years old now, and we had a director of the project, and for a state project, we had these environmental imperatives. They wanted to store water from the roof. They wanted it to irrigate the park. They wanted to store it. But the big thing that we learned is that a huge percentage of the energy that's used in a museum is lighting the pictures and lighting the museum. And so by being able to turn the lights out, we saved an enormous amount of energy with this daylighting strategy. Yes, you can turn the lights on if you want, if you're there after dark. There's a quietness there that happens when the lights are off, and you save enormous amounts of energy. And that was a big strategy because you needed to keep the museum at 50% humidity and 70 degrees. And so that took a lot of energy to do that. And you combine that with the lighting. These museums tend to be energy hogs, but by having this wheel, by storing the water, by using the daylight, we were able to develop a strong sustainability strategy way back then, okay? And so then we moved to the Corning Museum of Glass, which is a little bit out of order. We started this after the Glenstone Museum had started, but I'll talk about it first because it was finished next. So we had never worked on a museum of glass. We didn't know much about the properties of glass. So the first thing we did is we took just a normal alto vase out on the street in New York. It was a bright, sunny day. And the alto vase, as we began to twist it in the light, came alive. It began to sparkle. It began to embody light, this sense of containing light. It was remarkable, and we scratched our heads and wondered, how can we get this experience in a building? How can we get this experience of seeing these glass objects come alive like this? And we subsequently learned, that made us really curious. And it turns out that light is not the enemy, that temperature and humidity is, but not light. And so we began to embark on this strategy of bringing in enormous amounts of daylight here to make these works lift off the floor, okay? And so here's our site. Our building is there in white. There's a building by Henry Smith Miller and Laurie Hawkinson. There to the right, there's Gunnar Burkert's. Okay. And so then right away, we always work with Overharp with all of these projects to make sure we're not bringing in too much light. We have a lighting budget, we call it, for the yearly budget of daylight that we can bring in. We can predict the daylight on any day, any hour, any moment of the day. So we're able to tune the daylighting strategy for the works themselves, for the curatorial standards, so that everything is safe here. But here, we just wanted very quickly to put these objects, glass object, into the computer. You can see even the computer reads that these glass objects come alive in this daylight, okay? And we love this work by Ronnie Horn because it is this vitrine of light. It embodies light. It holds the light. It is light that is contained in this cube. And it was kind of, we wanted this to be a metaphor for the architecture, okay? And so here is the setup. You can see our building there that's kind of white, contemporary rectangle that's there. Henry Smith Miller, Laurie Hawkinson. And opening all out into this garden. Okay? And so we began to look at this, at these rooms as being soft rooms with just a few very unique corners. And then with these beams that would channel the light down to the floor. This was all glass, very few pieces were going to hang on the wall. So all of this light we wanted to have come to the floor. You know, most museums have 30-foot candles for the sensitive works. Some of the contemporary works can get up, like Dia Beacon up here in New York. It can have as many as 130-foot candles in the summertime. This museum in the summertime can have 450-foot candles that begins to bring this kind of daylight, this sense of nature, the moving, changing light from season to season, from morning to afternoon, to bring it in to the experience of these glass works like nothing else. Because again, we were able to capture the heat. So the heat from these skylights was above these beams, but the daylight comes through to light the works, okay? And then we have this one window here because we discovered that within each one of these rooms, if you look at a glass work against a window, against horizontal light, it begins to silhouette itself. But when you give it this light from above, you can begin to see the shape. You can begin to see the sparkle. So we have this thing that I call a porch that wraps all the way around these soft gallery rooms that begins to be the place of pause, of reflection, of time and distance before you enter the next room, okay? Each one of these rooms is curated in a very particular way, okay? There are these very thin beams and coming out into one of the porches here with these soft walls that begin to describe this soft light that's coming through. And you can see that up in the skylight, we have these panels. Some are solid Some are completely glazed with clear glass, so that in some cases you see these darting pieces of light, like that trapezoid that's there. So you sometimes you see that light as it's moving around. And then the others is white glass. All the other panels are white glass. So the light that's coming through is soft. Okay. We were almost about to give up. We couldn't find anybody to make these beams. These beams are about 3.5 inches wide and about 4.5, 5 feet tall. We couldn't find anybody to make them out of concrete. And finally, our last hope was this precast company in the depths of Canada, out in the wilderness. And we got to their shop, and you couldn't believe the beams that they had made for us. These things were straight as an arrow and perfect. And we made them out of normal bridge-like concrete. They were these remarkable things. Thank goodness we found them. They were shipped to the site, hoisted into place, and they worked beautifully to channel the light, okay? And so here's when you look up, you can see a certain percentage of this was solid light, so that you got a kind of slightly uneven light here, not a constant light, but an uneven light. You can see the artificial light is up within the beams for work at night, where all the sprinklers are, where all the smoke detectors are, okay? And so there's over these serpentine walls then, these beams begin to make this order, okay? And so then here you can see Scott Francis caught this beautiful light coming in against this Gardner moment, this Gardner glass sculpture. It's just these happenstances with direct light where it comes in and then magically leaves as your experience, your own personal experience with where the sun sits that particular moment, okay? And so here's the drawing that we made during the design process. We had these lifts to come up to wash the skylights, repair the sprinklers, deal with the smoke detectors, change the lights. Everything was built around these lifts that would go up and make all the repairs. The pitch of the skylights, we were in a very cold climate. We didn't want any condensation. But then these serpentine walls were designed by Guy Nordenson structurally, so that in fact, they are like the core of an office building. They are the core. So they take all of the vertical and lateral loads so that the skin of the building can be very lightweight steel. So the wind blows on that, transfers all the loads through the beams and into the walls, but also the walls were the mechanical plenum. So the air is coming up from the lower level into these cavities, supplying out of the top and returning in the portals. We were trying desperately here to make a building that was integrated between the light, between the structure, and between all of the services, okay? Okay. And so just to kind of weave through some of the works here and how they sit against these soft walls with light, okay? We got the most amazing concrete job, and this plasterer here I couldn't believe it when I walked in, a craft, an absolute craft with this wall, with all of this light coming down You couldn't find one imperfection. Just a remarkable job to find that sense of craft, okay? And then when these walls do come together around the portals, you get this moment of this corner moving from one room into another room, okay? And so with the skin of the building, this vitrine that metaphorically and physically holds the light inside. We didn't want this to be a clear piece of glass. We wanted you to feel the vitrine, to feel the kind of whiteness of the glass, to feel the surface as you're looking out onto the garden, so that that wall would have presence and you'd feel this vitrine, okay? And so it sits there next to this Wallace Harrison building from the 50s. This was one of the first curtain wall buildings that was made by Corning Glass. And it sits there opposite our building there to the right. So there was plenty of inspiration and pressure to make something as simple and something as innovative as his glass work, cladding this in this seamless glass, okay? And so here is this facade as it's quietly sits on the lawn. It is this vitrine for these contemporary works, these works of our time. This building didn't want to shout. It wanted to be this container for these works, this vitrine for these works that contain light and the works themselves, okay? And so as the building connected up with Laurie and Henry's building there to the left, we have a little gasket. And the one to the right shows this kind of fritting on the glass that in some light completely is one, and in other light, it begins to define that window, okay? Okay. And then I moved to Glenstone, which was, we started this project in 2010. And it certainly was one of the great life-changing experiences in my life to work with Mitchell and Emily Rales on this. They had a very loose program of what they wanted to make here, and I'll start with this next image, okay? And I always begin with Ed Reinhardt here. And if you know Ed Reinhardt's work, he makes these black paintings. And if you look long enough, you begin to see this figure within the painting. Sometimes it's a cross, a red cross, but you only see it after you've been sitting there for a while. He wanted you to get lost in the work, to slow down, to prepare for that experience. This is, we have this thing pinned up in our office, okay? So as an architect, we wanted to try to make gestures in our work that would define this slow experience of slowing you down. How can architecture make you slow down? Not only in the landscape, but in the architecture too. All to prepare yourself to see these works of art. This was one of the first moments we visited the site, and John Benner, one of the extremely talented architects in the office, put these together very quickly, and he just simply turned this little square green and began to remind us about heightening the experience of the landscape when you frame it, okay? And so before we knew anything about anything on the project, we began to make these renderings that just began to frame the landscape, to heighten this experience. It was like doing calisthenics before the run, okay? And so here is the final site plan, where you enter up there to the top of the slide, you park in those 3 squares, these bosque of trees, and you come to the little white rectangle there, which is a timber building. That's the welcome building. There's a little bookstore there. There's a place to get oriented. You cross the water, you cross the creek, and then you begin to walk. And you take this 5 to 7 minute walk. And in this walk, the day begins to drop away. You begin to experience this landscape. The worries of the day begin to drop away. Your car is left behind. And the rhythm of your body begins to take over. And you begin to prepare yourself for the pavilions of works ahead. And so then the pavilions then are built on this peninsula. And we arrived there because this is where the old barns were built. We didn't want to build in any other place where others had not built. We wanted to build where others had built. And it happened to be on this beautiful peninsula of land. So in a sense, we wanted the experience to walk around this peninsula here. We removed the food, so there's a beautiful little cafe in the woods. We removed the books so that these pavilions are all about the art, okay? And so as you walk, the pavilions begin to emerge, okay? And so when you arrive, you go down into the earth and you walk around this passage that is open to this pool in the middle. And then you go into each one of these rooms. Now their program was really unique. We have 12 different rooms. 9 of them are works that will be there in perpetuity. They were designed for those works. And so we could work with the artists, the ones that were alive. We could work with those art on the proportion, on the light, on the materials of those rooms. And so to honor each one of those works and each one of those artists, we pulled these rooms with their particular proportions apart from one another. And we set them softly into the land, so that in fact, these became these concrete vitrines, these containers that join the land and the architecture, the art, and the light as you moved around. So when you move into each one, sometimes there's a window that looks out at the end, but you always return to this pool of water and planting, okay? And here's the upper level where you arrive and then you go down into the earth, okay? And here is Riangi, this is another one we have constantly pinned up. How you sit on these steps, and he's taken out the horizon line. So all you see is nature, the sky, and the light. And it's this place of quiet, this place of silence this place of meditation that's open to the sky. And we wanted this place, this middle of Glenstone, to be this kind of place with this kind of spirit. Okay? And so here are the study models that we made. You can see these squares are kind of removable. We tried a lot of different arrangements here of these rooms, given the curatorial collaboration and the experience inside, which I'll show you in a second. Okay. You can see the topography of the land. We wanted to survey it. It obviously had to get completely dug up so we could build the project. But then these rooms get placed here, and then the landscape gets put back precisely the way it was before we arrived. Okay. And then there was a person named Steve Oles, who was a renderer back when he was a renderer for AIA. And Steve made these charcoal drawings that I remember when I first arrived in New York in the early 80s, and I loved them. And John Benner came up with a way of making these on the computer. And so we made many of these renderings, these kind of soft charcoal renderings, to begin to feel the elevation, to begin to feel the softness of these buildings as they sat in the light. Okay. And so each room has its own proportion, its own way that it sits in this topography. Okay. And so here's the first entry room off of the path. You arrive, you get oriented here, you're guided by light to turn the corner there, okay? And then you turn the corner and you follow the light down the stairs and towards the pool, okay? That's that amazing Lawrence Weiner piece, by the way, on the wall. And so then each room, this is the Bryce Martin room. It has this lantern above that we worked with Bryce with. It lights this room, the proportion of this room, the height of the clear story. Everything here was in concert with what this work needed, with the artist completely collaborating with us. That top little slot is supply air. That bottom little slot is the return air. So we have very few distractions in this room. The founders here, Mitch and Emily Rails, they only wanted 300 people a day to experience the landscape in these buildings, so that you would arrive in this room and hopefully you're here just by yourself or with your family, so that you don't have this crowded Metropolitan Museum of Art moment where there are hundreds of people around you. We wanted to prepare you to see these works in these rooms and have this personal experience, okay? This is the Cy Twombly room. We were fortunate enough to meet with him just before he passed away, maybe 2-3 months. And this room has these amazing sculptures in it that are from the 50s, I think, up until the 90s. We have top light that sends the light directly down to the floor. It's a particular proportion. You can see these concrete ceilings are one pour. These folks there who poured the concrete did a remarkable job of pouring a horizontal ceiling surface and then this upturn. That's a really, really tough pour, okay? And then you go outside for this Michael Heiser moment. So you leave the passage. It's a room that frames the sky. We worked with Michael Heiser on the height of the wall, the rotation of his work, and this is his outdoor room that frames this work that opens to the sky, okay? Another more cubic, this room is a perfect cube with the lantern above being another cube. It's the old Renaissance proportion there with this pape work in it, okay? You can see here that every one of the rooms has this passage. You go from the passage that is a constant where you walk around this pool, and then to go into each one of the rooms, you have this passage that is about shade and shadow, and then you move back into these daylit rooms into the light. This amazing Lorna Simpson painting is the only work that's in here, okay? And so here is a good example of how we move each one of these rooms back and forth against this consistent passage. Every time you move from a work back into the passage, you move from light to shade to shadow to deep shadow sometimes. You know, shadows and deep shadow, they don't belong to themselves. They belong to the light. Shade and shadow and deep shadow are part of the light. They are light. And so with every experience, we wanted to take you through this experience of shade and shadow and light so that all of the artificial lights are turned out. So that room that's straight ahead there, that goes into the Bryce Martin room that you just saw, where you go from the light into this deep shadow moment, and you see the light of that room beginning to project out. And then you turn and you're in the light again. So every one of these experiences walking around this place here, this pool, is about this journey into the light, okay? And here is Charlie Ray. He has a rotating series of exhibitions, okay? This is Ronnie Horn that does actually have these glass works out in the passage. And you can see how they're just capturing light. This one that is in the foreground here just absolutely contains the light. Okay. And this is a room that we worked on with Carrara with these extraordinary date paintings. We worked on this before he passed away. He wanted the light to fall 45 feet before it began to hit these works, so that the light would fall and be soft light on his pictures. He was this gentleman who got up every morning and painted the date. And he had to finish this date painting that day or he would destroy it. These are 3 paintings that are the dates of the moon landing. And he said to me, these were the happiest days of his life. And so these are the biggest pictures that he ever made, these dates back in 1969. But he also had this notion of this floor and the walls. He wanted you to feel this particular ambiance in this room. So under that wood floor contains petrified charcoal. And behind this plaster is white marble. And he he thought, and he gave me this amazing kind of treatise, this writing that he had done on why walking into this room with charcoal and marble here would be these vibes that would be this calming presence. That's why it doesn't have the usual white floor. It's got a wood floor so that the charcoal vibes can come through. And you know, I'm not going to argue with him. This was kind of a remarkable room here. Okay. Some of the sections. Okay. And then, so here is the pool. Once you get out of a room, there's a bench. You come and sit on the bench. You look at the pool. You see the light. And you then have time and distance and preparation to see the next room and the next installation. Okay. And then we also have this room that we affectionately call the pause room. This room that is clad in timber. Okay. Trying to frame the landscape. This is Mies van der Rohe, the Farnsworth House. I mean, whoever did this better than Mies? This idea of using these two planes to frame the land and intensify the experience. Okay. And so here in this room, we have this beautiful bench by Martin Purrier. And you sit in this wood room. We have a 30-foot long piece of glass by 8 feet tall. You sit and you frame the land. This pause room happens about halfway through the rooms. So you begin to give yourself more time and distance between the rest of the experiences, okay? And then these rooms begin to frame this water garden, this place of calm, okay? And so now we worked for a long time about what to make this building out of. You know, we wanted a 100-year building. Our clients wanted to build this so it would last for a long time. And we tried we tried stone, we tried everything. We couldn't quite find it until we began to look at Carl Andre here. And Carl Andre did something remarkable as we started to read about him. He took this ordinary material, these timbers that you buy at the lumber yard. He cut them precisely and he stacked them precisely. And he made something from the ordinary into the extraordinary. And we thought about that for a long time and began to try some things, okay? And so we finally landed on this just absolutely gray concrete. And we learned that by taking one of these blocks, which is 6 feet long, 1 foot high and 1 foot deep, they're load bearing, they stack. They have a 1/4 inch shim joint in between. That when you pour a block in the summertime, it hydrates very quickly and is a lighter block. When you pour a block in the wintertime, it still contains the moisture. And because we didn't have a lot of additives here, those blocks, as you poured them all year round, and we had poured these blocks over 18 months, about 25,000 blocks, they began to form this tapestry. And if you were lucky enough to pour a block and strip it right as it was raining, you got this permanent streaking. So it began to speak about this, not this precious concrete, but a material that began to show you its own integrity. Okay? And so here they are laying it, and part of the size came from this one lift that would lift the blocks into place, and they would set them. The person who is in charge of setting these blocks was an absolutely remarkably precise person. It shows you how one person can change a project through his precision, through the plasterer's precision, the curtain wall's precision. I have 3 or 4 people on this project, 3 or 4 individuals on this project who made this project. It goes back to that sense of craft, okay? And you know, I love these blocks because each one of them was handmade. They were hand set. The concrete was pressed and troweled. With each one, you can see on the top of it, when you look at them very closely, you can see some of the edges are a little bit ragged because that's where the trowel moved over. Some of the corners are a little, you know, these are handmade. That's what I love about concrete. It's a handmade craft with each one of the blocks, okay? This garden was modeled after Carlo Scarpa's cemetery outside of Venice, with these removable trays of plantings and this kind of raking of the planters through. And so every season, these plantings grow in a different way and get changed out over the seasons, depending on the artistry of the garden, okay? Yeah, these aquatic plants are just simply beautiful and change every day in the light, okay? A wall section here showing how the earth comes over the top. These really tall panes of glass, 23 feet tall, 9 feet wide, okay? Okay. And so now I want to turn finally to this project that is another life-changing project. It's this museum and theater that's in Warsaw. You know, when we first were contacted here, we got these kind of almost anonymous letters. And the first one said, will you fill these forms out for us and send them back? It was from the city of Warsaw. So we sent these back, very simple. Then another 6 months went by and they said, well, can you send us some pictures of a couple of projects? And we began to get a little more curious. So we sent those back. And then there was a third request to send a bigger portfolio and to fill out more forms. And finally, they invited us to Warsaw. And so, you know, I'd never been, so I hopped on a plane. I was really curious at this point, what is this project that they have? I didn't know any of the history of this place, any of the people here. And I got there and I postponed my trip and stayed there for 4 or 5 days. I met these folks. I saw the site. I began to read and was taught the history of this place. And it became an amazing tale here. And I could see that they were in this kind of remarkable renaissance. And you know, in some cases, a work of architecture becomes, you make it before the Renaissance happens. And in some cases, you make it after the Renaissance happens. And it's either too early or too late. But here I felt like after going around the city, seeing the collection, seeing the exhibitions, talking to the theater folks, that this was a renaissance that was happening now. And so then we were invited to this competition. We were the only American. There were 15 Europeans. And for some unknown reason, still, we were selected. And it was, so this has been from about 2004, this has been this kind of remarkable journey, okay? So this starts with Harry Cobb, the great architect with Paycobb Fried, IM's partner. He told me that in 1947, he was on a Fulbright with Harvard traveling through Europe. And all of a sudden he came to Warsaw at the very beginning of the Soviet occupation. And he took these pictures. And when I was here about 3 years ago in Warsaw, all of a sudden they had exhibited, there's a huge exhibition of Harry's pictures. And the people of Warsaw flocked to this place because nobody had ever seen Warsaw in color. They had only seen it in black and white. The Americans were the only folks who had this color film, this Kodachrome film. So these were very particular pictures that showed this place after the aerial bombardments by the Germans, okay? And so by 1957, here the Germans, long before, had flattened the city in retaliation for the 1944 Warsaw Uprising. They left absolutely no trace of history. Stalin here is taking over, and he is removing all of the remnants to just completely flatten the city. He has built back this palace as a gift to Warsaw there in the background. The city planning is beginning, and it's all under Stalin's thumb, okay? So Stalin now begins to rebuild. You see the subway down there? The palace was constructed between 1952 and 1955. You can see the city has hardly started rebuilding. This palace was planned with a majestic square, with a big square for parades, for tanks, for a platform for Stalin. But this was a symbol of oppression. Over the next 15 years, the city begins to emerge, okay? And so now we jump ahead to 1989, marked the end of the communist government. And in this picture here, you see that in 2004, Poland joined the European Union. Capitalism arrived. It begins to look like any other city in Europe with this kind of, with the towers, with this kind of almost anonymous contemporary architecture, okay? And so here you can see the Palace of Culture as it is reborn and becomes a part of their culture and a part of the heart of the city. This is the main square. This is where they have soccer celebrations, for goodness sakes. And this is where our museum is located. And the story behind this site gets even more interesting. This project didn't start with me. It started over 10 years ago when the mayor didn't want these two institutions in the middle of the city. He didn't want them at all because with every exhibition, every one of them, they stuck a finger in the eye of the local government and the country's government. And so they were pushed out of town. They didn't want them here. And there was such an uprising here. There was such a protest that the mayor finally, and he had to agree to put them right at the base of this Palace of Culture, where these two buildings would sit in this park in the center of the city. And this is the odd part, they hired an American architect to sit and try to interpret all of this, okay? And so then when you look at the artistic culture of these two institutions, they engage this contemporary culture here. They are the voice of Poland. They are the voice of the culture in Warsaw. It's the home of discourse and dialogue. During turbulent times, these are the two institutions that speak. It's very much about this place and time. This is not where they exhibit Bryce Marden's. This is not Michael Heiser land. These are works from this place, about this place and these times, okay? Like this work here by Monika Sosnowska, she made this work exposing the failure of the architect Oscar Hansen's utopian vision during the rebuilding. It's a precise replica of a structure in the town of Lubin. She then crushed it. She's a remarkable artist. She crushed it. She's actually been one of our critics as we've been working on the building. What an eye, and what a work this is. This is one example of this voice of the artist critiquing the history and critiquing the lives of these folks. Commenting, okay? Now the architecture of the museum and the theater, we're searching now at this moment for how the architecture of each institution might express their own unique and true ethos. So we began the investigation of the theater as a place of shadow and light, so that the lighting, the actors, the audience, the set become more present. Okay? And then for the museum, we wanted it to be this vitrine of light. We had been working on that with Corning, working on that with Glenstone. The light of Warsaw is what defines the museum. The presence of light, these rooms that embody the light, that brings honor and celebration to these works in Warsaw. Light is the principal building material here. Okay? So shadow and light. It's a way that we began to understand the ethos and how to express these two institutions. We wanted to create this kind of elusive atmosphere for each, this very particular atmosphere, okay? These are very early sketches as a way to begin. We are between the palace, this kind of readopted place, and this commercial on the other side, this kind of shopping mall. We saw a real need for abstraction in this context. Strong architecture that could be cloaked in this sense of permanence, okay? It's a search that we've been on for 6 years now, this search for clarity, for a strong work, a monumental work. We weren't afraid of this notion of monumentality. We needed this monumentality, this monumental work that could hold its own against the palace and hold its own against the commercial architecture across the boulevard, all in separation, all in celebration of the importance of these two institutions. And I'll say that again because this is what we talked and discussed and argued about for years. How do you celebrate the importance of these two institutions in this city and in this context? Okay. So we searched for these appropriate materials and we found this white concrete. They have this European tradition of pouring concrete here. It is this white concrete, this white vitrine that holds the light. It has this remarkable texture when you get up close. It's crisp. You see all of the panel joints. You see all of the tie holes. It has this depth that is remarkable in the light and in the shadow. And then this cast steel from the shipyards in Gdansk, embodying the shadow. It is a treasury of shadows. It inspires mystery. Shadows, as we said before, are a part of the light. Even a space intended to be dark should have just enough light to tell us how dark it really is, okay? The theater opens to the city, the square, and to the park. It participates in the life of the city and the pulse of the city, and is embodied in the culture of Warsaw, open and welcoming. The theater belongs to the people of Warsaw. When we worked with the theater director here, he wanted these big doors to open up so you could have a performance with folks in the square, folks in the seats inside. He wanted on a Saturday during the week when they were building the sets for you to be able to walk through the building. He wanted on performance night for you to sit on the steps and watch the makeup being applied. He wanted everything to belong to the city, this process of making these performances, to be embedded in this city, in the culture of the city, to be about them at this particular moment, okay? And of course, this kind of darkness was really curious to us. Here's Richard Serra's amazing work. He stapled this piece of paper up against the wall. It's kind of, for me, it's always been kind of a space of imagination that inspires this kind of mysterious moment. This dark, dark shadow that when you look at it long enough, it still belongs to the light. We're searching for this understanding of this shadow, okay? And then this masterpiece by Louise Nevelson and our reflected ceiling plan of the ground floor on the right. It is about this ordering of the shadows. We could have never understood this ceiling without this kind of ordering that Louise Nevelson has. There's deep shadow there, there's shade. It is just this remarkable study that we tried to find in the ceiling of the project, okay? And so here is the Palace of Culture and the theater together, order against order, okay? The theater is in red, open to the square, the palace and the park. Museum is in blue. The space in between them belongs to both. It makes these cultural connections. You walk through to get to the main square, all sits at the base of the palace. And it has this space in between, this living room between these two institutions, okay? This is our strict zoning envelope. Not 1 centimeter could we vary from this. The arcades, the height of the arcades, the height of the wall, the building lines, all to relate to the lines of the palace here as this envelope, as these buildings sat. This was part of the law here as we started the project, okay? So this is the museum and theater together. The space in between belongs to both. This kind of place for performance, this place for art, connects the park and the square. It is the living room of Warsaw, okay? So here's a plan of the 3 levels of the museum. The blue is what connects the patron to the city. On the ground floor, the blue is this continuous arcade where you come under a low curtain of concrete and you come into this 6-meter tall space that is this threshold all the way around. And this blue arcade opens to the city. There's an auditorium there with huge sliding glass doors that open up. There's a reaction gallery where an artist is given a month to make a work that represents that precise time. There's a classroom, a cafe, and this big central stair. And then upstairs, we call these rooms city rooms. And it's like these wood rooms at Glenstone, these pause rooms that frame the city with these big windows. So that in each one of these clusters of galleries, they become these places where you can rest and prepare. These are not flexible rooms. The curator, the director, were very specific in their program. They didn't want a flexible museum. They wanted these very particularly sized rooms that the curators had to respond to. So the art relates to the proportion of these rooms and the light, rather than making these rooms in a flexible arrangement. So these rooms are permanent, and each room will define a work that is about the way they are curated at those times. Very particular and very unusual in these moments of flexibility, okay? And so these special rooms are an expression on the facade. They give light. They frame views of the city. There's that continuous arcade down below. That big one up above is a terrace that opens out to the city. They are these expressions of the connections into the city. Okay? And so when you arrive in one of these rooms, you frame nature, you frame the city, you frame the park. And when you frame it, it simply heightens your experience as the light moves. For that brief moment, it marks that passage of time, okay? So I'll just run through these Glenstone slides here briefly. You've seen these, framing of the landscape, preparing you for the next room, okay? And then here are these rooms in Warsaw. There's a library there, these enormous windows that open out to the city, okay? Rooms of quiet, okay? And then this central stair is a social space. It is the center and the heart of the museum. It's filled with light. You immediately see the organization of the museum. Moving vertically is celebrated. And we have this kind of classical stair that starts in one place and it parts going up and down. So you can see friends. It celebrates the movement going vertically and peels away for the light that falls in the middle, okay? I was given critiques by artists there that were every time I would arrive, and I loved every minute of it. There was one critic who was really tough on me. He said, the architecture shouldn't have anything delicate or in any way decorative. That's not the vitrine that these works want to sit in. And nothing decorative. Okay. A simple white concrete vitrine that holds the light, and the windows reveal this kind of softness of the wood inside these pause rooms, inside the city rooms, to give that framed glimpse of this place, okay? And so then we learned, of course, with Glenstone about this house of rooms, this kind of place of rooms, the specificity of the architecture that curates the art. And with Glenstone, the joining of the art with the room. Not this ultimate flexibility, but suites of art rooms, all organized around this central stair, okay? And at Glenstone, these rooms were these specific proportions with light and material, all in the service of this work by Cy Twombly, okay? And these moments of pause and reflection, just flipping back and forth now between Glenstone and Warsaw, these lessons of pause and place, okay? These art rooms on the top floor are filled with the light of Warsaw. The structure here is on a very particular rhythm. We're building over a subway that was built during the Soviet era, so nobody knew what was down there. And they could only go down in very particular places with columns and these enormous beams. And so the rhythm of all of the structure here is the rhythm of this underground piece of archaeology that's there. So the light is passing through this mapping of this structure, okay? So here is the subway, these underground levels opening up to the light on the top floor, receiving this beautiful clear story light from the side, so every room has a sense of daylight, okay? And we built models of every single room, every single piece of structure here, as these big beams and smaller beams, all in this concrete, can begin to reflect this sense of archaeology in these rooms that have very thick portals to reinforce the transition and the definition of a room, okay? This large gallery at the top floor celebrating the arts and the culture. This big room, this heroic room, this really tall rooms 7.5 meters tall here. And when you finally arrive, you have this tint of daylight, okay? And it is this quiet light that's always changing from east to west, this clear story light on the +1 floor. From winter to summer, east to west, north to south, it moves and it changes to light these rooms completely differently, this quiet light, okay? So that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for being patient. I hope that didn't go too long, and I would be more than pleased to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Thomas. And thanks for sharing those experiences. That was really a great set of projects. And, you know, I'm particularly looking forward to the Borsal project, seeing that finalized and published. We'd like to keep the spirit of an in-person lecture alive with a little bit of Q&A here. And to supplement the usual Q&A, I would like to be joined by a couple of our architect sponsors. These include Frank Dittenhafer of Murphy & Dittenhafer, Chris Dawson of Chris Dawson Architect, Matt Luttrell of Think Design, and Benedict Dubs of Murray Associates. Thank you all for your support and agreeing to be part of the discussion. If anybody else has some questions, we do have the chat area inside the meeting format here. Feel free to type your questions. I will do my best to make sure I read them aloud and get them answered. So Frank, do you have any questions you'd like to pose to start the conversation?
Sure. Thomas, thank you for a wonderful presentation, very inspiring. It was great to hear you talk about the rigor that you go through in designing how light filters into the exhibition spaces and framing of the landscape. And the question I have, I'd like to hear you maybe talk a little bit more about the exterior opaque material selections. You talked a little bit about Glenstone. It was a little bit of a struggle, and maybe even in your answer going beyond the 4 museums, you know, what is the rigor in your process? You know, what would tell you that brick is right, or stone, or metal? I mean, I'd just like to hear more about when do you know you have landed, what's the process and the rigor you go through on that exterior envelope material.
Well, you know, that's a really good question. I'm not sure I'm completely level-headed enough to answer that. but the work is clearly, I think, a search for simplicity. These works we do are reductive works, I think, where we try to eliminate this kind of complexity and noise. And because we want to find the appropriate material so that when the light falls on these simple forms, it begins to honor that material. And so at Glenstone, we have been reductive with those simple blocks so that when the light moves around these platonic objects, you begin to read the light and the material. With the United States Courthouse that you see in the upper right, mm-hmm. that volume there contains the light as you move around. So we were extremely reductive with the form and with those little louvers that each one of them holds the light. So we do search for that simplicity there so that you can honor the light and you can honor the material. And I think, you know, in looking back on our work, there aren't so many buildings that look alike. And so I think the only thing I can surmise at that is that we really, I think, start each project with this fresh notion of trying to understand what to make it out of and what is going to solely make these forms simple and resonate with this experience.
Great answer, thank you.
Chris, Matt, Benedict, anything you guys would like to add?
Okay. This is Benedict. I'd like to return back to North Carolina, please. I loved your description of the roof and how you crafted that from a very inexpensive system, if you will, but the tuning of that light, focusing it, and then being able to utilize trims. I'll say I don't know that piece of architecture very, very well. Tell me a little bit more about how you tune the light using that form to really create what is an incredible rhythm of highs and lows, but still has a sense of very warmth and continuity and kind of wanting to pull you through the space from one area to the other without having walls I just think that the system is incredible. I'd like to hear more about the crafting of it.
You know, that's a good question. We set off on this journey to try to diffuse the light. So on the roof, we have a series of louvers that are there that takes all of the direct light out and cuts a little bit of the quantity. We have some glass there that cuts even more quantity. And so each one of those oculuses then has this scrim above it. And the rhythm came, oddly enough, from the dimension of that sprinklers could be apart, the dimension of light tracks that could be apart from one another, the dimension that a light track could be away from a wall. All of these kind of very technical, very important pieces of the building came together in the rhythm of the coffer, that it had to be on this 6.5 foot by 27 foot grid. And so then we looked very carefully at this coffer, and we modeled it and modeled many, many different kinds of coffers, and found that if you brought the light in the middle and you limited the size of the oculus, that you could then bring the light in and with this shape, spread the light out to the walls and down to the floor. And that coffer must have taken us 6-8 months to sculpt and to try it out in model form, to try it on the computer so that we wouldn't get any shade up there, but it would just be a true reflection of how the light is coming through that oculus and spreading itself onto the walls. We were given the 16-foot height. We took that up as much as we could afford, which is another, I forgot, another so many feet. And that it became that rhythm. So, you know, it was certainly not that we loved the way this looked, although I think it's very beautiful, but we didn't start from that point. We started from this, it's gotta work point, and it's gotta deal with sprinklers. It's gotta deal with smoke detectors. It's gotta deal with maintenance. You know, it's gotta deal with light fixtures, you know, and it's gotta deal with all of the dimensions that go along with all of those particularities.
Well, thank you, because it's just very elegant and just very lacy and light, and it's just very exquisite. So beautifully done.
Well, thank you so much. So nice of you.
So Thomas, Matt, can I go next? I was just going to ask, this is Chris Dawson. All the work is stunning, but I'm particularly enamored with Glenstone. I've been there several times. I was curious if you could talk about how you met the rails, how you know, how the experience there has dramatically changed with your creation of the pavilions there. It used to be a very almost standoffish experience. It's a very unique experience, probably my favorite place to go be with art. And then what is your favorite piece of art that they have on display there at Glenstone?
You know, I met them through, you know, a kind of a general selection process. I got a letter from them one day asking us to submit some work. That's when they had maybe 30, 40 architects. It was narrowed down to 15. We submitted a little more work. Then it got down to 6, and we went in and I met them for the first time. And I began to feel their presence. They're quiet, they're serious, they're thoughtful. And I listened to them, and we then took them to see the North Carolina Museum, and they narrowed it down to 3 people, and it was a little competition. And it was not an ordinary competition where you submit the work. It was over 6 months, for goodness sakes. And we had the choice to meet with them as much as we liked or as little as we liked. So I latched onto them because I saw something in them that was this kind of bit of silent magic, you know. I felt their presence. And so I worked on the design during the competition with them. And they didn't, I mean, so the 3 of us sat around the table and made the building. You know, they had this program, this really unusual program with 9 of these pavilions having this art in perpetuity. And we talked about how to express that. And so this became a very personal experience. And when you have an experience like that, it's a life-changing experience. I met with them often. They were amazing critics. They were supportive. They critiqued the work. They were everything one could imagine. And they really made this work with me. And so, you know, it was one of those experiences that one looks for in life. In terms of the experience there, you know, what do I like the most? That's a really good question. I'm not sure I've got a favorite. I was just there over the pandemic, and I saw the Lorna Simpson painting, and my knees got weak at the door. This amazing blue picture on the wall. Every time I go there and I see what they've changed. They have this beautiful Charlie Ray polished stainless steel sculpture now that I love. They've got a Michael Heiser work out in the courtyard outside of the offices that is just amazing. So it's hard for me to find a favorite child there. But you know, the Glenstone experience was hugely important to me.
Yes, Thomas, this is Matt Luttrell. I would like to echo the sentiments earlier. The work and the presentation are absolutely spectacular and poetic, so thank you very much. My question has a little more to do with some of the background and the inspiration. I noticed you have certain images you use, and then looking at your website, you have 20 images up, you know, very specific images. And then also the portion dedicated to models, and I saw how you had the models throughout the presentation. I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about the inspiration, the precedents, how you use models, how you use some of these specific images to garner the inspiration for each of the buildings. Thanks.
Well, yes, thank you. You know, our process is it's a little bit all over the place. You know, we set up a Pinterest board and we put on the Pinterest board everything we can think of that remotely relates to the project in terms of the program, in terms of landscape, in terms of light. I mean, it could be anything. And so we have a series of precedents that we refer to. We have a series of models that we begin to build. We work in Rhino on the computer. We sit on the site. We try to learn about its history. We try to learn about the institution that we're building. You know, I love to do houses. You know, you might have seen a lot of houses on our website. I love to do houses because it's a very particular journey with a family, with two people, with one person. This very particular journey of a site, of a place, with light, with landscape, in a city, and these particular people in the way they live. Because we learn more from just the experience of making these houses than we do anything else. And I'm not sure we could have made a lot of the buildings we make without the very personal kind of relationships that we have. But there's no particular set process that we go through. And we just never quit. We, you know, we obviously live in the real world. We have project managers on the other side. We've got, you know, folks on the other side with schedules and cost and everything that everybody else has. But we work right up until the line. And if there's a way, if there's something that we discover at the 9th hour, we try to squeeze it in. We just never sit on our hands. And I think that is been the most important thing as I've gotten older as an architect, to just never be satisfied until you put the key in the door.
Thank you.
This is Frank. I'll throw another one out there, Thomas. Just like to hear maybe reflect on you know, the influence or experience with Richard Meyer, directly or indirectly, and maybe translate it to what you think your staff, you know, and your firm is taking from collaborating with you.
Well, you know, I think that, you know, Richard was a person that I looked up to when I was in school. I went to Clemson and I would go to Atlanta, which was the big school, which was a big city and town. And I knew of the work, and all of a sudden in like 1974, 75, he came out with this beautiful white book. And I bought 2 copies of it, the only copies that probably ended up in the South. And I loved them because they were filled with light. And so in the time I was with him, I thought about light. And when I went to Rome and looked at the ruins and walked down to the Pantheon every day, I thought about light. And so I think throughout these early days of this kind of journey that I've been on, I think it comes back to trying to be on this path, to understand the light. And it's a constant topic in our studio. And, you know, I think we are an extremely collaborative studio. You know, I don't take a sketch. I don't really sketch much. We sit around some of the round tables there, the whole team, and we work together. As we've been doing Zoom, that's a little bit more difficult, but we have been sitting around the table and we work on an idea together. We go back and we draw it. We gather around a computer screen. We gather in the model shop. We gather another precedent. But it is a very collaborative studio. We have very, very small teams there so that everybody's got a ton of responsibility and is involved. And it is, you know, it is very much of a kind of round table conversation that we have. It's very participatory.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Tom, I have two comments written in the comment section here. One is from Bob Kelly, who is also another Clemson graduate. It's more of a comment than a question. He says, your approach reminds me of my favorite Gronkowski quote. Simplicity is not an end in art, but we arrive at it as we approach the true sense of things. And that was from Bob Kelly. And then the question we got from Ruben Zeist, is there a way that you deal with the unpredictability of the sunlight as a building material? To what degree do you attempt to control it versus let it be unpredictable? And it seems that in the Corning, it embraces the serendipity, whereas in North Carolina, it seeks to control it. And he's just wondering if you could reflect on that.
Well, that's a really good question. And certainly I love the quote on simplicity. Can you send that to me? I really love that. You know, we do, you know, we sit around the table and we build models and we talk about light and what the light's going to be like, and we look at precedents and, you know, well, there's the Kimball, and, you know, I mean, we talk about this light and we talk about it with our clients, and, you know, we get so, we really think we know what the light's going to do. And it's amazing when the building is built and it's open and you walk through it, the light is a complete surprise. I mean, it means that we set up the ingredients, but we have absolutely no idea what it's really going to feel like. And I say that honestly. Same with Glenstone, same with the courthouse, same with Corning, same with North Carolina. I mean, light is so elusive. You just can't believe that it can be so different from what you imagined. But what we've learned from that is that if you set up the proper ingredients, something amazing is going to happen when you leave it to the daylight to respond. Something is going to happen when you put that much work into the light. But it is nothing like what you think it's going to be.
Yeah, it's encouraging to hear. Oftentimes we labor over details and we're frustrated when one thing doesn't turn out right. It's encouraging to hear that you get to enjoy your buildings on a different level after they're actually completed and inhabited.
Yeah, well, you know, it is kind of, you know, to turn them over, it is kind of a slightly sad moment. You put your heart and your life into these. And when you're all of a sudden told to go away, we're going to occupy it now. You have to come back as a visitor. It's a different experience.
Well, unless anybody else has a pressing question. Oh, Chris, was that you?
I was going to ask Thomas if he had any good Seth Wentz stories. It sounds like you guys hung out together a little bit. And I love Seth, and there's always good stuff that happens when you hang out with him a little bit. Thomas, do you have anything endearing to share about Seth with everybody?
Well, one of the things that, it's good I can't see you all because I have a little bit of stage fright. Not particularly when I get up in front of a huge group, but when I'm in front of a small group, I do tend to be very quiet. And so his story about me only speaking every so often is absolutely right. And I certainly remember that jury. I think, Seth, that was the jury where we gave Frank Gehry the 25-year award for his house, right?
Yeah, I believe it was.
Yeah. So that was really a great moment. I've always thought Frank Gehry's house was like a Robert Rauschenberg moment, truly American. And it was great that Seth and the rest of the jury and I could all come together and give that thing the 25-year award. And also, Seth has been extremely patient with me. I've been signed up a couple of times to come and speak to you all, and you all have just had the patience of Job with me. I've had some competitions and trips that got in the way, and so I really appreciate you guys being sympathetic, and I'm glad we're doing this.
Well, thanks for coming in and joining us. Truly, this has been a great experience, and I know it's been a challenge to get everything to work out. It took a pandemic to make it happen, but I'm really glad you were able to share these works with us. And with that, we're approaching 2 hours here, so this concludes the spring lecture. Again, Thomas, I really want to thank you and your crew for taking the time to make this possible. A special thanks again to our sponsors. Without the sponsorship, we absolutely cannot make this happen. And hopefully, if the fates allow, we do have a fall lecture set up for November. Hopefully, we'll be able to meet again at the Armstrong campus in person. Sorry for those who have stage fright. But really, truly, Tom, this has been a great evening. Thank you so much for making this happen.
Well, thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.
All right.
Thanks a lot. Keep up the good work.